Welcome to the Hotflash Inc. podcast. I'm your host, Ann Marie McQueen. Off the top, I want to thank Phosis, founded by Susan Campbell. Phosis is a company obsessed with repairing, replenishing, and restoring your dry perimenopausal skin. Susan created this line out of her own need, like so many women who are working in the perimenopause space. It's exceptionally clean and clinically proven. I've tried it. It's just absolutely beautiful skincare. So thank you, Susan, for stepping up and sponsoring the first ever Hotflash Inc. Summit. We're coming back this September, so stay tuned for details. And if you're in the market for clean, beautiful skincare, use the code Hotflash Inc. to get 15% off at Phosis.com. So here at Hotflash Inc., we are all about telling the truth about menopause and midlife, using scientific evidence, human experience, and expert opinion. My guest today is Sarah McKay, an Oxford-educated neuroscientist, author, and speaker, and the founder of the Neuroscience Academy, where she teaches brain health and applied neuroscience. She's the author of a number of books, including the Female Brain Book, and she brings a rare mix of scientific rigor and clear-eyed honesty to topics that are often clouded by noise. In this episode, we dig into menopause and the brain, what we know, what we don't, what the science hasn't caught up with yet, and what people are saying that isn't exactly true. So we talk about what's menopause and what might be a self-fulfilling prophecy or the crazy modern pace of our life right now. We talk about how cognitive load might be one of the real midlife stressors we're not talking about enough, the so-called brain blips of midlife, and the inadequate tools we have to measure them correctly, why just don't get dementia is not a satisfying life goal, why the metrics around dementia are a lot more nuanced and they involve things like incidence and prevalence and not just 2/3 of all dementia cases are women, and how science does sometimes fail women, not because there's nothing there, but because the research hasn't been done well enough, long enough, or thoughtfully enough. And then we get into all the problems with the way people are presenting the research. And you're going to hear her say, you absolutely must report absolute risk. And I'm so excited to dive into what is a kind of a dry statistical subject, but so essential. She's helped me understand it, and we're going to help you understand it. We also have a very frank discussion about the pill and why risks involving the pill, and also in this nascent area of hormone sensitivity in women and how that might be a factor to what happens when you go on the pill later on. We also talk a little bit about what our moms experienced, some of these sensational headlines that have nothing to do with the truth or are based in studies that are done in animals that have nothing to do with menopause and end up being a focus and a push for hormone therapy. So this is a long conversation. I urge you to settle in and stick with it. As the Aussies say, it made me feel heaps better about my brain. And then editing it felt like a second wave of no nonsense, fresh air. So if you've been feeling worried about your brain in midlife, and who isn't, this conversation is for you. I'm Ann Marie McQueen, journalist and proud 50-ish woman, and we are here looking for the true truth in perimenopause, menopause, midlife, and beyond.
Opening our minds to other possibilities is not always easy.
Hotflash Inc.
You're all woman to me. All right, Ann Marie.
Just to off the top, with everything that goes on in midlife, colliding with the hormones, colliding with this complete information overload and the advent of AI, which I know I'm struggling because AI helps me do more, but then I do more and then I can do more. What do you see with this collision?
About 6 months ago, I started worrying about my own brain because I started my very specific, I turned 50 in January, my very specific midlife brain problem, of which I have had zero issues up until about 6 months ago. My very specific problem has been just using words. I would be like, well, I'm sitting here looking at the TV. And I'm like, no, I'm not. I'm looking at the phone. Like, why did I say TV instead of phone? Or I might say, hey, you've got a nice lid. I mean, hat. So I would use these words which were semantically quite closely related, but they weren't the right word. And this has really just sort of started happening in the last 6 months. And I don't know whether that's a real thing or whether I've just been bombarded with messages that something is bound to go wrong. So as soon as there's one tiny little slip, I focus in on it and go, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, is this the thing? Is this the brain fog thing? So, there's a lot of things going on. And what I also started noticing was, because I've got teenage sons, right? We would have a conversation, and then maybe 2 or 3 weeks later, I'd ask them a question, and they'd be like, Mum, you already asked us that. And Mum, we already talked about that. Mum, I showed you this. I showed you that. And I'd be like, gosh, I barely remember that conversation. But you know what I've noticed is I'm always listening to a podcast. I've always kind of got my phone next to me. It's almost like I started to carry it around like it was this precious little baby that was just consuming all of my attention. And then I read a paper talking about how if you have, and this has been repeated and there's meta-analyses now, it wasn't just a one-off, that if you have your phone in the same room as you and you're doing a cognitive test on working memory, your working memory scores decline by a point or two, even if you've got the phone turned off and it's in the room, because it's almost like a baby. It's just sucking all your attention, and the cognitive load required to ignore it kind of sucks away at your resources. And I thought, I wonder if the reason I keep forgetting the conversations I'm having with my kids is not some neurological thing. It's because I'm always plugged into a stupid podcast. We're literally doing a podcast now. I'm wondering, and so what I've tried to, and so I thought, I'm just going to stop listening. I haven't listened to podcasts in weeks. I'm just going to try and just reduce the cognitive load on me. And when I'm at home, I'm going to plug my phone in and treat it like it's attached to the wall, like they used to be in the 80s. And lo and behold, I feel like I'm remembering conversations because I'm just giving my brain time to process the conversation I had instead of doing all of this cognitive multitasking. Have a conversation, go back to the podcast, have another conversation, go back to the podcast. I'm never letting anything digest.
Right. You wouldn't work out. You literally wouldn't exercise all the time.
And I've spent so many years thinking and writing about and communicating about this concept of baby brain, how feeling foggy and forgetful during pregnancy and or in early motherhood isn't some neurological deficit. It's probably a lot of the rewiring or reorganizing our brains go through to ensure that we focus in on our baby and keep it alive. And our memory depends on the information we take in and what we filter out, because it depends on attention. And when our attention is consumed by something incredibly salient like a baby or maybe a phone, perhaps, there's similar things. So I'm just sort of starting to not, because I feel like we've been primed, and I say this all the time, especially as women, as soon as you hit puberty and you add some hormones into that female brain, it's just dysfunctional. And as soon as there's a blip, you go, well, it must be me and my little lady brain. So I was like, well, I surely I should absorb my own messaging and try and explore some other things that could potentially be going on at this point in time.
That is so interesting. It's interesting to hear you doubt your own brain. I remember years ago reading about the gravitational pull of the phone. And that's what it sounds like what you're talking about. But also with all the podcasts and all the learning, I was listening to very much music. And this week I've been listening to music again. And music is so good for our brain. So you feel it coming back. You feel it coming back.
Well, I feel, and I haven't really kind of changed anything. I actually, to be honest, I probably was drinking quite a lot earlier this year because I turned 50 and I kind of went mad, having loads of parties and dinners and travels and things as well. And I thought, maybe I should just kind of calm down a bit. So, I've changed a couple of things there, but I feel like it was more so, and I've always slept well and I don't have depression and there weren't really any other challenges. But I just started going, I wonder if our brains are I'm just so constantly, not distracted, but constantly multitasking. I'm constantly thinking about more than one thing at once. And really, I should be paying attention to my sons because one of them's going away to uni next year. So there's not much longer that he's going to be around the house all the time. I thought, well, I need to just set everything aside and just go back to the basics. And that's what I've tried to do. And I feel like it's definitely made a difference. I'm not trying to just constantly be consuming content.
You mentioned something there about how women are so hard on ourselves about our brains. I know my brother was he was just telling me he's in his 50s and he said his daughter was after him because she said, I texted you this. And he said, I have to scan everything. And so I feel like women are like, our brains, but men are going through it too. Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. And men just haven't been primed to think that their brains are broken. They've been primed to think, well, it's everyone else's problem.
Yeah.
Or, I've got too many competing demands and I can't remember everything. How do you expect me to be as brilliant as I am whilst doing all of the things? Whereas we've been primed that, and particularly because I'm more familiar with the kind of the theories about baby brain and maternal and, the neurobiology of matrescence. As soon as you forget something in early motherhood, you go, oh, well, it's just me and my dumb little mum brain. And what we see is that cultural trope and the constant self-flagellation, it's not your brain letting you down, it's the competing demands on you. But that's driven the research as well, because women have kept talking about having baby brain. And so the scientists keep going in and let's just do another battery of cognitive tests on the women and see if we can kind of find the deficit. And we're not finding it. Well, maybe because it's not there. And we've started to see a bit of an expansion now and more kind of breadth of thought. Now that more women are coming in and doing the research and asking the questions, is blowing open the cultural stories and starting to go, well, hey, maybe there's some strengths, maybe there's some upsides, maybe there's some benefits. And I think maybe we should sort of start applying that to midlife as well.
So we're primed to blame ourselves. And then we enter midlife and we're told that our brain is failing largely. Yeah.
And there's all kinds of messages out there. And I think, and this is not to say if you experience something, it's all in your head and it's all made up and people are just telling you stories that you're believing. Certainly we do experience, particularly some women, but not all women, going through perimenopause, the roller coastering emotions. We don't need to belabor these points because this is your gig. We do know that can have knock-on effects in terms of how women perceive their cognitive capabilities. There is a lot of subjective experiences of, like, my brain isn't working properly and what we might colloquially call brain fog. Now, in some women, that is measurable just with the types of cognitive tests that we've got, but in other women, they may have the subjective experience and it's not objectively measurable either. Perhaps what we also need is more sensitivity around the types of cognitive testing that we're doing in midlife. And I know there are researchers out there that are kind of working towards, if we've got women saying, I have this subjective experience of brain fog, like how can we measure that? Because most of the cognitive tests that we've got at the moment that we would be deploying are kind of tests to see whether we've got like mild cognitive impairment or maybe those kind of first signs of, unhealthy brain aging or Alzheimer's disease, and they're not sensitive enough to pick up like those tiny little blips. Perhaps like that kind of the verbal kind of switches like I was experiencing, or, the verbal recall, that kind of verbal gymnastics that lots of, like, especially very intellectual, smart people who rely on their verbal skills, if they're slipping slightly, they'll notice that. And so maybe we need some more sensitive kind of testing in there. But, a lot of the time women are kind of going through this midlife transition and there is this kind of real experience. What we don't quite understand is what is underpinning that. Is it directly due to the roller coastering or the withdrawal of hormones, or is it sort of like a bit of a domino effect whereby we've got impact on sleep? Even if you're not waking up at night, you might still have your sleep architecture disrupted. Are you having some kind of other impacts with mood? As soon as you start adding mood disorders or anxiety or depression into the mix, then that's going to also make you feel like you've got brain fog because, your attention's going to be skewed. You have got that midlife collision of overwhelm. We don't necessarily know exactly what the cause and effect is of all of this. But there's a few different kinds of theories floating around and lots of good researchers working on it, thankfully.
And I think it bears repeating, first of all, that the brain goes through restructuring in perimenopause and your cognitive abilities change. Can you just frame that for women listening?
Yeah. So there's lots of different ways in which we can measure brains and look at how brains might change across the course of the lifespan, or compare different groups of people, or we can look at it from peri to post menopause, and we can look at the structure of the brain, and we can look at like how the brain functions. We can look at tests of cognition. And the studies that we've got looking at brain structure, so like let's put someone in an MRI scanner and scan their whole brain and kind of measure grey matter volume and measure white matter integrity, how well organized different kind of connections in the brain are. Some studies are showing what we see in women is not necessarily anything different than what we would see across that trajectory of aging anyway. Because you could have someone who enters perimenopause at like 42. Maybe they don't like enter full menopause until 52. So you've still got 10 years of aging in there. So it's kind of hard with women to tease out what is that natural course of aging and then what is directly due to kind of neuroendocrine aging as well. And some studies are saying, oh, yes, actually what we do see is sort of a slight grey matter volume reduction, and then that kind of bumps up again, almost kind of like recovers or bounces back post-menopause. Other studies are saying actually what we're seeing is not really any changes that we would expect outside of normal aging. So the data in that sort of space is still quite mixed, because what we genuinely need are good longitudinal studies. We don't want like case control studies. We don't want to just compare a group of women at age A and a group of women at age B. We want to have a large cohort of women and follow them all the way through this whole transition. Because if we've got a longitudinal study, then we've got like the temporal cause and effect. We can see these different trajectories and see what came before that. So that's what we need. The smaller longitudinal studies we've got at the moment don't appear to be showing anything more dramatic across that course of aging in terms of grey matter volume that we would expect to see in men of the same age. And this is so often what the situation is around menopause. The data is mixed. White matter structure and organisation, again, it does look a little bit like there might be some kind of changes in how well organised white matter is, but mostly kind of during this kind of perimenopause transition, and then that appears to kind of stabilise. And then there are other types of ways we can look at kind of brain metabolism. How well is the brain, metabolizing glucose? How well is it using ATP? How, it's kind of like metabolic health. And again, we see it kind of go through this transition where it gets to a point where it needs to kind of adapt and adjust and react. And then you kind of come out the perimenopause. And again, those changes appear to flatline. It's like it's going through a neurological transition, a bit like how it goes through pregnancy or it goes through puberty. And then you kind of come out the other side. And a healthy brain will adapt and respond and settle into a new normal. And certainly that's what a lot of the longitudinal studies of cognition, which is another way we can look at how the brain's going. For women where we can pick up these measurable changes in, like, say, verbal recall, again, it might be like during that transition time, you're scoring a point or two less on what you would expect. You come out the other side, your scores are back to baseline again. So it's a transition. And the brain is great at transitions, and it's been practicing doing that through our female reproductive lifespans. We had puberty, we've had menstrual cycles, maybe we've gone through multiple pregnancies. The brain is pretty good at adapting and responding and flexing and, finding a new normal. There's also some other studies which are, again, we don't have a lot of them, but look at what we might call functional connectivity in the brain. So how well the different nodes or hubs within the brain connect and communicate and interact. And when you're going through puberty, your brain hubs and nodes, they get very specialized, and each kind of little region gets kind of very streamlined and specialized at doing what it needs to do. And we see similar types of patterns emerge when you learn a new skill. When you learn a new skill, the kind of brain activation is quite diffuse, and then it kind of consolidates and gets very kind of segregated and streamlined as you learn a new skill. What we see as we're going through menopause and into kind of these later stages of perhaps mid to late midlife is we see brains kind of going, like, I want to retain efficiency, but I can't be as efficient as I used to be. So I need to kind of recruit some more neurons on board. And what we see is less segregation and more integration. So you might get the job done, but the brain might go about it in a different way by recruiting more neurons together to get the job done. So again, it's adapting and responding and flexing to these new stages of life. So we kind of, I guess, we perceive, I think we kind of think you get to age 18 and it's on the decline. But midlife's always, doesn't matter whether it's males or females, midlife's always been quite understudied. We've kind of focused on development, and then we've focused on, aging and diseases of aging like Alzheimer's and dementia. There's always been a bit of a gap in midlife, particularly that kind of cognitive trajectory we would go through. And like, we've got all of these other kinds of work emerging as well. That's not just looking at menopause, and not just looking at brain structure, and not just looking at is this degenerating or not, going, well, what skills do we see peaking at midlife? Because lots of people are like kind of at their cognitive best at midlife. I spoke to a surgeon the other day, a plastic surgeon, and he says he reckons the peak age for surgeons is 53, because you've like got all of the years of experience and wisdom. You've done your tens of thousands of hours, but you haven't sort of started to lose the fine motor skills yet. So he's like, if you want to choose a surgeon, choose a 53-year-old surgeon. I was like, that's kind of an interesting take. So there's lots of skills that we see start to peak at this point in time as well.
Yeah.
There's some new research looking at things like cognitive flexibility, and cognitive flexibility is the ability to adapt and respond and see shades of grey and pivot and not be set in your ways, and not be like seeing it, you know, like the youth are like the young ones. Everything's like black and white. It's dramatic or not. I have these firmly held beliefs and that is it. And then when you get into later life, perhaps you get a bit more set in your ways because it's harder to, you know, challenge yourself. Whereas at midlife, we're kind of pretty flexible. Now, whether that's because life makes challenges such that you need to be flexible, or whether it's kind of a inbuilt kind of biological kind of trajectory, we don't quite know. But yeah, there's all of these things going on, yet I feel like the entire focus is in on what's going wrong with our hormones and how can we not get dementia, as if like the only thing that we need to be thinking about this age is let's not get dementia.
Well, let's talk about that. I just feel like there's such an effort to make these changes of midlife permanent. I've seen you on social media sort of fighting back against what happens, I guess, stemming out of the FDA when Dr. Roberta Diaz-Brinton made a 5-minute presentation and mentioned this temporary situation that I'll get you to explain. But it turned into, a couple of months later in a podcast, the brain eats itself in midlife. And then I saw
without HRT,
I saw a very popular doctor say brain death. Have you heard that term, brain death? So it's like, I feel like there's this movement to, it serves a lot of people to make the changes and uncertainties of midlife a permanent thing for us. So from when it comes to the brain.
It wouldn't be much fun if we got to 50 and then all that we spent the rest of our lives doing was trying to avoid dementia. There's not a lot of joy. There's not a lot of joy in that. I mean, the ice bath boys and all of the bros of, you know, trying to avoid dying from, you know, their mid-20s.
That doesn't look fun.
And they're trying so hard not to die. And it doesn't look fun. And I don't want to get to this point either and spend the rest of my time trying not to get Alzheimer's disease. I want to have a little bit of fun along the way, right?
Yeah.
So, the brain eating itself without HRT. And I just try and do my thing and stay in my lane and talk about my neuroscience and do my brain health stuff on social media. And very, very rarely, used to maybe like 15 years ago, like kind of go and yap in the comments like, that's not true. Blah, blah. And then I just got sick of it. I just wasn't interested in that whole kind of myth-busty thing. But the brain eating itself during menopause without HRT, I must have got 20 messages coming in saying, have you seen this? Have you seen this? Is it true? And it did stem from a study that was done in rats and mice by Roberta Brinton, and, you know, various other people have kind of weighed in on this. And she was looking to see, well, what happens in rodent? I think it was, let's just say it was in mice. What happens in rodents' brains when they kind of go through their reproductive senescence? And the thing is, with most animals, apart from humans and some species of whales, when we finish our reproductive years, then we just die off. Humans don't. We could carry on for another 50 years if luck is on our side. And in this study, she was like, well, what happens when we've got this withdrawal of hormones before brain death, before the animals die? What do we see? And there are some ideas in there, and we do see this in human brains, but we'll set human brains aside for a bit, whereby we know that neurons in the brain require glucose for energy. That's kind of how they, you know, metabolize and get their energy, and they turn that into ATP. And they're very, very, very metabolically active because they're electrically active. So 25% of the glucose that is used by cells in your body is used by neurons in your brain because they're very, very metabolically busy and active. We don't even need insulin to be able to absorb glucose into neurons either. It's kind of an insulin-independent glucose metabolism. What we see when mice get to the end of their reproductive lives is we see that kind of ability of neurons to metabolize glucose with the same efficiency sort of start to dial down a little bit. And we're not entirely sure what those reasons are. And what the neurons start doing is they start casting around looking for other sources of energy, because it's, pretty fundamental that they, keep their energy stores up so they can carry on doing what neurons do. And then they'll cast around for other sources of energy. Now, some of those sources of energy could be ketones. We can make ketones in our liver. They can also use lactic acid, which is produced in muscles when you exercise muscles. And so they can draw all of these different sources of energy into the neurons, into the brain. And there's actually some other cells which kind of act as sort of a go-between between the bloodstream and the neurons, and these are called astrocytes. And astrocytes in the brain kind of help with this kind of transition between, am I going to use glucose? Am I going to look for something else? And the astrocytes kind of help the switch back and forward. And that's a very adaptive thing that would happen across the lifespan. But without estrogen in the picture, what we do start to see is the glucose metabolism gets a little less efficient. And so there's the requirement for the other types of molecules. Now, one source of ketones is also the brain itself. And so we have another type of cell in our brain called an oligodendrocyte, which makes myelin, which is the fatty white matter which coats and insulates axons themselves. And because this is fat, this can be used as a direct source of ketones. And so in some cases in these mice, what they were seeing is they were going further and further and further through their reproductive senescence. The astrocytes started metabolizing some of the fat within the oligodendrocytes themselves and using that as a source for the neurons to metabolize energy. And there's a bit of a switch back and forward, and that can kind of happen at different kind of ages and phases of life in humans too, where astrocytes cast around for different energy sources for a whole host of different reasons, not simply because estrogen levels have dropped. What happened in these mice was, as they were kind of nearing the very, very end of their lives, some of the metabolism of the myelin was such that the oligodendrocytes, because typically they wrap round and round and round and round axons, like layer upon layer upon layer of like pastry, and they sort of started looking kind of a bit looser. And so on a scan of that animal's brain, it might look like the white matter was disrupted slightly. So I suppose you could say that that breakdown of myelin to feed the neurons that the astrocytes are contributing to was the brain eating itself, because you could call that like a catabolic process or catabolism. I suppose a shorthand way of saying that is the brain eats itself, which is highly melodramatic, if you ask me. The thing is, this has never been shown in humans, number one. And number two, the study in mice had nothing to do with hormone therapy or not. It was simply not testing the idea that without hormone therapy, the human brain will do that to itself during menopause. We saw this cool little experiment in mice. This is a cool little experiment, hasn't been done in humans. And the cool little experiment in mice had nothing to do with hormone therapy. But it was just all conflated. And I mean, the sole reason that story was told and went gangbusters on social media was because that specific clip was cut from a couple of different parts of a podcast. Because if you watch the whole podcast, the clips were actually cut and rearranged and put together. Because I've gone and watched the whole podcast, right, to drive a social media algorithm, because it was melodramatic and it was exciting. And, like if that's what you want to, that's the kind of messaging that you want to do to drive an agenda or, drive traffic to your website or whatever, I suppose, if you're happy to live with that being like the kind of ethical platform from which you run a business, I suppose, go for it. But it was called out because straight away people realized how incredibly dramatic and non-evidence-based the messaging was. I think the problem is, there's a couple of problems here. One is just social media is just kind of outrageous, right? And we know that. We tell kids that, but we're kind of falling prey to it ourselves. Two is that we've got some really good scientists out there in the world who are doing a lot of research, and some of them just, one, haven't got time for social media, or two, have considered it and thought, I just can't deal with the drama. I am too busy to be in there doing myth busting and to be in the comments and to be arguing with people. And I don't like going and arguing with people. Very, very rarely will I ever do that in the comments and social media. If I'm going to do something, I will say, like, let's talk about the data. I don't want to talk about other people. I want to talk about the data. So we've got this real gap between the good science that's being done and good, clear, calm science communications. And this is what we want. We want science communication, which is detailed and which is nuanced, and that's boring and that doesn't drive the algorithm. That's very different from influencing. It's also very different from advocacy as well. Advocacy is agenda-driven. Science communication should be about sharing the science and the data without the drama. But drama is what everyone's, listening to.
So the push is, this all seems to be part of the push that, look, taking hormone therapy for your symptoms, it's not enough. We need to almost create this fear and belief that you need to take it to prevent. So let's focus on dementia.
Yeah,
That's your
to
space.
prevent disease. Yeah,
So
100%. We just don't have the evidence to say that hormone therapy will prevent dementia. There are lots of different types of studies out there in the world, and some of them go back to the Women's Health Initiative study, and some of them are new, and some of them are case controls, and some of them are biobanks and data sets. You could even put the question into something like Consensus AI, which is like an AI-powered kind of little mini systematic review of the evidence. Go into that and say, does HRT prevent dementia? It will come up saying, no, the data is mixed. We can cherry pick the little studies that suit that. I don't know why people are so insistent on wanting this to be true when the data is so mixed and says it is not. Surely it should be enough to say the evidence that we have for taking hormone therapy is to treat symptoms that you're suffering from in the time, vasomotor symptoms. Perhaps there's some evidence that it might help sleep if vasomotor symptoms are waking you up. There's evidence, I believe, around osteoporosis, and that's in some clinical practice guidelines. But no clinical practice guidelines anywhere in the world, whether they're menopause clinical practice guidelines or brain health practice guidelines, say take HRT to prevent dementia. And the reason they don't say that isn't because the work is kind of hidden away or you've been lied to or anything like that. It's like literally the data is mixed. And the way I like to kind of talk about it is we understand when we're talking about risks and we're talking about protective factors as well, I like to think about it like old-fashioned scales. And so you've got various weights that you can put on where you're going to try and tip, may the odds be in your favor. I mean, nothing's 100%. You could never smoke a cigarette and still get lung cancer, right? So you want the odds to be in your favor. So you put as many things on the side that that will protect your brain health as possible. And so we know what protects brain health. And then there are other factors we know that may increase your risk of poor brain health or dementia down the track. And some things we can't do anything about, like getting older. You can't necessarily do anything about your genetic kind of makeup as well, the genes you got from your mum and the genes you got from your dad. But you could probably do something about lowering your risk of cardiovascular disease, or maybe if you've got untreated hearing loss in midlife, or maybe making sure that you exercise and eat healthy food, all of the kind of the boring things. And we've got some pretty well-established protective factors and some pretty well-established risk factors. But when it comes to menopause hormone therapy, right now, we don't know how big and heavy that weight is and which side of the scales to put it on. And there have been numerous research studies that have looked at this, and they're always kind of coming out going, oh, look, it could even be net neutral. Some studies look like they're showing a bit of an increased risk, depending on the age at which you start, depending on the formulation, depending on whether, it's, transdermal, estrogel and micronized progesterone, or whether it's conjugated equine estrogen and whatever the progestogen was that they were using, back in the old days. So some studies are going, oh, it looks like there's a bit of an increased risk. Other studies are going, oh, it looks like it might be a bit protective. Other studies are going, oh, it's kind of net neutral. And so right now that's just where the data is at. Why we can't just be okay with that and go, well, let's just use it to treat the symptoms in the moment is beyond me. I'm not entirely sure. Maybe like if there's this other idea here that if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and everyone's petrified of dementia, so it's kind of like an easy story to tell to make people feel better, and then they trust you, and then they feel happier and calmer and more likely to pay you money. I don't know. I'm just being cynical about that.
No, sometimes I do think people, it's like, okay, because people have said to me, and I'm taking hormone therapy, or I plan to take it to protect my brain. And I'm like, okay, that's okay. I'm curious, when you go on the Mel Robbins podcast, congratulations for being on one of the top podcasts in the world.
Yeah, that was a bit of a. I thought when they emailed me to invite me on it was a prank. I thought it was one of those scams that people invite you on a podcast and steal your Instagram followers.
That's hilarious.
I had to go and check everyone on LinkedIn and go, are they real? Is this true?
That's exactly what I would be. I would feel like I'm being pranked. Well, so I'm curious because she's had the biggest doctors who are saying this kind of thing, right? She's had the doctors who are saying this kind of thing. Sometimes it bothers me a little bit that these podcasters that the biggest doctors are going on don't know anything. So they're just nodding and not challenging and being like, oh, when you go on with your message, how does that land? Like, do you think?
So I suppose I guess kind of the intention behind that question might be, why isn't she out there? Why isn't she there challenging people when she's heard one story from one person and one story from another?
No more.
Why isn't she acting more like a journalist and going, well, Mary Claire Haver said this and you're saying that?
No, she's not a journalist. It's more just what is she doing when you say the thing that you say that's so different from the thing that they're saying? Do you think?
She literally said to me before we started, she said, look, some people will, hate what you're doing. Some people will hate what you say. Some people hate me. And she said, that's fine. Just whatever. Who cares? Just ignore all of that. She said, this isn't a got ya. This is like a platform for you to share your message. And whatever you say is great by us. And if afterwards there's bits that you want to take out that you weren't happy with, then we'll take them out. And then we'll run this by you and then we'll send it out into the world. So she's almost kind of acting like a little bit like a kind of a neutral platform. And her questions are she's a very good listener and a very, very good interviewer. And she's very good at distilling down what you said and wrapping it up in a bow and then going, oh, what I heard you say was, and you'll hear her do that. She said, what I heard you say was A, B, C, D. And I'll be like, that is much more succinct than how I said it. She's very, very good at that. But I guess what she's doing is just keeping it kind of in the moment in your messaging. And the criticisms would be that perhaps she should be going, well, someone, last year said the opposite. She doesn't do that. I suppose this is perhaps why, this is why science likes to do things like systematic reviews and meta-analyses and clinical practice guideline reviews, because we're trying to look at the consensus of ideas, not just package single studies up to send out into the social media world for consumption. I don't even know if people watch a 90-second reel anymore. Maybe they just want kind of a 50-second soundbite or a 10-second soundbite. I suppose the problem that we're up against is, and I'm pretty long-winded, I do have trouble being succinct. It's problematic, and people are too impatient and don't want uncertainty. They just want one little message that they can take away and rely on.
Well, having watched this wave, and I sort of met you a couple of years ago, it does seem that, first of all, there's that obviously a divide in science and the way people approach parsing the literature. And you can see that in every industry. We have in journalism, there's the way I would do something, and then there's that guy over there, and he's a little bit more loose and fancy, he's not as careful. But it does seem we've had about 5 years of this increasing messaging that's very simplistic, right? Like you're at risk in perimenopause and menopause because you're losing estrogen, and that means that you'll get dementia. Estrogen is the cure. And it does feel like when you look at some of the followers of the people who've been saying that for a long time, like their brains are almost what has happened? Like they it's almost like they glitch if they see anything that's outside of that.
It gets all very tribal, and there's a lot of identity wrapped around in it. I also think that there's just general problems with understanding and then communicating statistics, which is incredibly boring. And we're getting more and more familiar with the statistic. If we look at Alzheimer's or dementia, Alzheimer's and related dementias, 2 out of 3 cases of that are women. Therefore, it must be something about biology. It's probably menopause. Therefore, it's hormone therapy. That feels like a very logical kind of story to tell. But people aren't even going in. And do you know who put me onto this? He said, go and look at the prevalence data and then look at the incidence data. And that was the queen of women's brain health, Pauline Mackey, when I interviewed her, she said, do yourself a favor and look at prevalence and look at incidence, and then come back and we'll kind of think and talk about this more. She is just like, I don't know, I hope she's going to do more than 2 like Instagram posts ever. Now that she's entered the chat, we want her in, and we want her to stay. And it's interesting because I think no one even sort of stops to interrogate the 2 out of 3 data, that number and what that means. And we've got a difference between, as Pauline told me, between prevalence and between incidence. And I even have a picture of it right here because I brought some notes with me. I have like the prevalence. I always call it like the prevalence pool, the prevalence bath. I've sort of drawn this picture here.
Okay.
So prevalence is like everyone's swimming around in the pool of water, the prevalence pool with a disease. And how do you leave the pool? Well, you die. So that's mortality, who dies out. But then you've got incidence. So incidence is the inflow. And so you could have, in some countries in the world, we've got increasing incidence of cases of dementia, but we've got actually the inflow is sort of slowing. Prevalence is increasing because there's more people swimming in the pool, and that's because there's less people flowing out of the plug hole. But prevalence can increase at the same time incidence decreases. So you could imagine like you've turned the tap down and it's just trickling in, but it's still filling the pool up. Or you could have like incidence, you could have it gushing in, you could have incidence increasing and prevalence increasing. And so that's really interesting. As soon as you start thinking about these 2 things separately, then that means you can start thinking about, well, how many people are alive with the disease, but what's causing people to get the disease in the first place? And do we see a different incidence between males and females at different ages and different kind of generations in different countries in the world? And what we see in many countries in the world, yes, prevalence is increasing because more people are living longer, both men and women, but the incidence is decreasing because we're getting better at treating a lot of the diseases that cause people to develop dementia. So we're getting better at treating cardiovascular disease. We're getting better at educating people when they're young, so they've kind of got a whole lot more cognitive resilience, so they're kind of declining from a much higher place. We're getting better at treating hearing loss. We're getting better at treating depression. We're getting better at treating high blood pressure. We're getting better at treating diabetes, high cholesterol, et cetera, et cetera. So we're getting better at that. So in healthy, wealthy countries, the incidence is like slowing down slightly, but the prevalence is increasing because less people are dying. And the low and middle income countries, and particularly low income countries, particularly places, and studies are coming out of South America, studies are coming out of countries in Africa as well, where we've got this massive incidence like flowing in. They haven't got the great prevalence yet because people were dying off much younger. But now the incidence is starting to flow in, and it's particularly women that are flowing in because they've got the less access to healthcare, they had the less access to education. So we can see the incidence rate in different countries in the world and over different generations vary. And that's what's contributing to is it always going to be the steady 2 out of 3 cases? And once you start thinking about numbers like that, you move away from going, women, menopause, hormone therapy, as if that's the logical kind of conclusion. And I think that it's tempting to make sense of it using what feels intuitively right. But the data is telling quite a different story. And that's important because the data gives us access to a whole lot of different opportunities for prevention and a whole lot of, more insights into, what are the causes, what are the risks, what are the protective factors. So I must thank Pauline Mackey for kind of, as she does, she is the queen of this, is steering me kind of down to a much clearer way of thinking. And that's why it's so good she's now on social media, because she's very good at explaining this sort of stuff.
Very good. The other thing that I hope she explains, and Susan Davis did a video about it, and I've been trying to explain this in a post that will be an Instagram post, but I feel like I haven't quite got it right, which is relative risk versus absolute risk.
Yes.
And
we must absolutely report absolute risk.
Yeah, we absolutely, and no one does.
Absolutely.
And everyone reports relative risk, including people who criticize the Women's Health Initiative for using relative risk to exaggerate the risks.
Yeah. So, 2 things. Remind me to talk about the TGA product package inserts for estradiol here in Australia. Okay. We'll just set that aside. Remind me to talk about that. So absolute risk, and one easy way to think about it is you could talk about there being like a 50% increased relative risk in like cancer or dementia if you are on or off a certain kind of drug. Like, you know, you're not taking a drug, and then if you start taking the drug, there's a 50% increased risk of developing brain cancer, say. But it could be the absolute risk was something like 2 out of 1,000 people will develop brain cancer anyway. 3 out of 1,000 people will develop brain cancer when they take the drug. The increase from 2 in 1,000 to 3 in 1,000 is actually a 50% increase. It could be like from 2 in 10,000 or 2 in 10 million to 3 in 10 million. It's still a 50% increase because it's the relative risk between the two. But what matters is the increased risk. Is the increase from 2 in 1,000 to 3 in 1,000 not worth it? I mean, if it's death, it might not be worth it. But if it was like dandruff, you know, two and 3 of us have dandruff, and you take the drug, 3 and 100 of us have dandruff. It's not really a big deal. It doesn't really matter. But the 50% is still there. So that's where that relative risk versus absolute risk comes in. And the best way to talk about it is not just to use numbers, but is to use arrays. So we've got data because we've gone and studied how to communicate statistics and numbers to people, particularly people with low health or numeracy or science literacy. And you can show an array. You can go onto Canva and make like a little array of like 100 little people, and you can draw like 100 little dots or 100 little people, and you can go, well, you might get 10 people out of 100 developing depression over the course of a year. And then maybe you've got people starting to take this brand new type of, I don't know, dandruff medication, and you might get 20 out of 100 of them, start developing depression. You go, well, that's actually quite a big increase. Is it worth treating dandruff if you're going to end up with depression? But if you show people this, then they can kind of make meaning of the numbers. It's not just numbers floating around in their head. You can actually kind of see what this means. And you could even like kind of flip it around the other way. You could go, 98 people out of 100 won't get depression. Not on the drug, and then maybe they start taking the drug, and you could go, well, now 96 people out of 100 will still not get depression. So you could flip it around and report the numbers in the opposite way. But if you show it pictorially using an array, that is the best evidence-based way to communicate this risk. Now, with all of the black box warnings and all the controversy about whether they should be going or not for vaginal estrogen, but for all the other kinds of menopause hormone therapy in the US, I know that there has been some chat here, and I'm not sure whether it's going to get any traction or not, that our kind of warnings on menopause hormone therapy here in Australia that the TGA kind of puts together and puts as a package insert need to be kind of got rid of as well. But what the Australian TGA does really well is that they report absolute risk data for you're taking hormone therapy, here's your risk of breast cancer. We're taking hormone therapy, here's your risk of dementia. And they use absolute risk. So it will say, if you are a woman aged 50 to 54, there's 1,000 of you aged 50 to 54, 20 out of 1,000 of you may develop breast cancer over the course of the next 5 years, not taking HRT. And if you start taking HRT, 27 out of 1,000 of you. And that is an increase of 7 out of 1,000 people over the next 5 years. And so they've literally got the absolute risk data in there, very carefully and clearly laid out. I don't think we should be removing that. I think it's actually useful that it's in there. It would be even better if it was a little like drawing with a little array. But this is the problem. We've got people that just aren't wanting to take, I suppose we can't expect everyone to be a statistician, but even perhaps GPs sitting down and talking through absolute versus relative risk with people in a careful, calm way.
I think there's probably, I don't know why people use it. I think maybe they don't understand it, even though they studied it. It's hard to explain.
Yeah.
Social media posts would not be very interesting.
Well, you can draw your little arrays. If you draw it out and people see it, they can often understand it. And there's another statistic in there that I know Pauline Mackey often talks about, which is the number needed to treat. Yes. So, you would need to treat X many people to reduce the risk of one person getting a disease. But actually the data shows that for most people, most consumers find number needed to treat to be quite a confusing statistic to make meaning of. So again, we're kind of coming back to showing them absolute risk data we should be doing, because often the absolute risk data is far, far lower and far less scary than what people think.
Or particularly in making a case for the prevention benefits with heart and brain with hormone therapy, it would help people make decisions much more clearly, because I think people hear it reduces your risk by 50%. And they think, and I used to think this before I knew about it, and I was a journalist. I used to think it was me now, and then it would cut my personal risk by half. And I think that's right. And it doesn't mean that at all. It cuts your personal risk. You, an individual person, sometimes by a fraction of one figure. And so if you know that, you're much less bamboozled and pulled around by health reporting.
And I feel like, because I've worked in neuroscience and medical research for many years, and then I kind of moved into science and health communications and journalism. And, you know, this was kind of our bread and butter for so many years, almost kind of in the early days of social media. I've gone to conferences, like whole workshops on how to talk about absolute versus relative risk. And that's where that help. We used to walk around going, absolutely report absolute risk. It was kind of just a bit of a joke. And now it's suddenly becoming so important to think about. So things like incidence, prevalence, and absolute relative risk, they're the bread and butter of health and science communication and medical journalism, and have been for a long time. It's just, I suppose, not very flashy. It's not like it's not glamorous. It's much more glamorous to like have your beautiful hair and makeup and like, you know, look cool and go on a podcast and, you know, sound
a whopping 30%, right? Like you hear
or your brain, or your brain will eat itself without hormone therapy, which, you know, it's far easier to kind of go bah, you know, which is a sad state of affairs. And that's why I'm hoping, I don't think that this campaign here in Australia is going to get traction, because I think that the current messaging on the product inserts here that the TGA here in Australia has put together are pretty, you know, well done.
Okay.
Maybe I should do an Instagram post on them.
That's excellent. Like, do it. I think, I mean, we need to change this narrative on relative risk, the way it's reported. That would take a big effort like that.
Yeah. And, you know, so many people have spent so many years complaining about what a disaster the Women's Health Initiative was in terms of how that was communicated. And I was working for a breast cancer organization back in 2002 when that came out. I was finishing writing up my PhD. I'd moved back over here to Australia. And I hadn't started doing my postdoc research yet. And I spent about 6 months working in a breast cancer organization. And I was there when that came out. And I remember it was like this war room. They were like kind of huddled up, like, how can we communicate this? And fielding calls from the media. And it just went like kind of wild. Although for me then, and like it must have been like in my early 30s, it just felt like very distant and kind of meaningless. It was like, oh, it's something my mum does, menopause or whatever. It didn't really seem relevant to me at the time. But I remember how hard they tried to counteract the story and the fear. And it's very, very hard to counteract fear once that's with numbers. It's hard to do that. And we've spent so long criticizing that. Now we're almost kind of, the pendulum has swung the other way. We're again using poor communication of science to drive a different agenda. I'm not sure what it is this time. And I think because women keep getting told there are gaps in women's health research, they think that means there's zero research. There's not, just because we need more doesn't mean there's none. We've actually got some quite good data about things. And maybe the fact that the data for so far for hormone replacement therapy and dementia risk is mixed means it might be net neutral. Maybe it's just always going to be mixed. Maybe it's just not really ever going to be clear. And we're just going to have to be okay with that and look for other ways to reduce risk. And quite frankly, socioeconomic, you know, kind of factors are, you know, social determinants of health are probably a far louder voice in the room than estrogen.
So we had an interesting discussion behind the scenes because I said something like natural ovulation, your natural cycle is healthier. And you said, hey, be careful about that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And it was
Yeah.
interesting because
Yeah.
that's an interesting subject, because there's a lot of data to say that hormones, the birth control pill, is safe, but it's like you get put in the position of defending like what the body was supposed to do. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
So I'm sort of wondering what's your take on that?
I mean, again, I just kind of look at the data. I don't really have strong opinions one way or another. And I used the pill for many years, and I didn't use it, and then I used it again, and then I didn't use it, and now I'm using hormone therapy, and there'll probably become a time when I go off that. And I think what we need to be doing is thinking about how we communicate risk and absolute risk, because for a long time, and there still is messages out there that the oral contraceptive pill causes depression. And so we can look at large data sets and go, well, if we see women are prescribed the oral contraceptive pill and then we see if they're subsequently prescribed an antidepressant, what are the numbers here? It's been widely reported that it's like an 80% increased risk. Well, it's an 80% relative increased risk. So what are the absolute risk stats out there, and what are the absolute risk stats for different age groups? So we can kind of start looking at it like that. So we can look at both what are the short-term outcomes and who is perhaps vulnerable or sensitive, and who does the pill not suit, and what other options are there out there. But for a lot of women, if the pill does suit them and it doesn't cause depression, then, do we have data that long-term the health outcomes are negative? And again, we don't have that data necessarily either. In fact, we've got some data. Again, data is mixed. There is some data from some of the biobank studies saying that long-term pill users have a slightly decreased risk of Alzheimer's disease. Now, that's emerged from a number of different studies around the world, but there's also data not supporting that. So again, the data is mixed. No one's saying go on the pill to prevent dementia. Can imagine, no one would start saying that these days. But again, it's about how do we communicate this information clearly. I think mixed up in that is the idea that women who are naturally cycling, who then perhaps have disrupted cycles, maybe they've got endometriosis or some other kind of, for want of better language, hormonal imbalances, then like ovulation, your menstrual cycle is a vital sign. But I don't think taking the pill so you don't ovulate is the same as someone who isn't ovulating because they've got some kind of perhaps disorder or disease or dysfunction underpinning that. So again, I think it's just about looking at the data and clearly and calmly communicating that. We've got pretty good data in this space, but again, a lot of the scientists who are doing this work are reluctant to get on social media and communicate it, and particularly once you're starting to talk about reproductive health and contraception, etc., because it's just so chaotic in the US talking about that. They're almost, whether they're scared or whether they're just like, I just don't want to even open up that can of worms. I would rather just do the science and get that data out there. So that's kind of where I sit with that.
You had a good nugget in there. I think you said something about women who might not do well, or women who might be more prone to depression on the pill. I think there is an area there of study with all hormones of a sensitive type of brain, or
100%.
Okay.
100%. And we've got data emerging, and again, there's some good researchers working in this space who aren't on social media looking at hormone sensitivity. And what they're almost starting to think of is that hormone sensitivity might be this kind of trajectory that we see across the lifespan. Maybe these were girls who went through puberty early. Did they go through puberty early? Was there like some kind of early life trauma perhaps? This is not all women all of the time, but maybe their brains and nervous systems are more sensitive to the natural ups and downs of hormones. Maybe they're the ones who the pill doesn't really quite suit them. Maybe they're the ones who get postnatal depression. Maybe they're the women that end up going through perimenopause and getting depression. And once you've kind of got one of these events happen, then it increases your risk subsequently. And there's been proof of principle studies of hormone sensitivity. You can look at women in perimenopause, put an estradiol patch on them, get your hormone levels up really high, and then rip it off, and you can have a placebo patch and an estrogen patch, and then look to see if you remove the estrogen patch, who shows the increased rate of depression, and it'll be those women that have the prior experiences. So it appears that there's probably some type of hormonal sensitivity in some women some of the time through the lifespan. But again, sometimes that gets conflated to everyone all the time, and everyone has PMS, and no one should be on the pill, and everyone should be on HRT. And that's not what the data shows. It's, again, being more thoughtful and careful and just like calm the farm with the comms, I think.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. Well, it's an unscientific thing to end on, but I sometimes think about, our moms and their rates of dementia.
Yeah.
And I sometimes think about the things we know that are risk factors for dementia. And I think about what our moms faced. So they couldn't really work the job they wanted. They had a couple of jobs that they could do: nurse, teacher, flight attendant. I think.
Yeah. Secretary. Yeah.
They had to get married. They weren't, my father passed away last year, and on the house, my mom her name wasn't on the house. She never owned the house. I remember thinking, well, how does that feel to never really own your house? They had low fat. My mom was always doing Weight Watchers. They didn't.
Oh, yeah.
And
Yeah.
I sometimes wonder, what those factors have to do with dementia.
I don't think it's unscientific, and this could be what is kind of changing those inflow rates of incidence in different generations. Like how people lived their lives in the 1920s and 30s and 40s is very different to how we're going to live our lives in the 80s and 90s, and then our children's generation, how they're going to live. And this is where we're going to see dementia rates wax and wane in lots of parts of the world that don't have access to education or healthcare or opportunities or agency.
Okay. Thank you so much. It's so great to speak.
It was so good chatting.
Yeah.
Good to have a bit of a rant.
Hotflash Inc. was created and is hosted by Ann Marie McQueen, produced and edited by Sonia Mack. The information contained in this podcast is intended for informational purposes only and is not intended for the purpose of diagnosing, treating, curing, or preventing any disease. Before using any products referenced on the podcast, consult with your healthcare provider, read all labels, and heed all directions and cautions that accompany the products. Information received through the podcast should not be used in place of a consultation or advice from a healthcare provider. If you suspect you have a medical problem, i.e. menopause or anything else, or any healthcare questions, please promptly see your healthcare provider. This podcast, including Ann Marie McQueen and any producers or editors, disclaim any responsibility from any possible adverse effects from the use of any information contained herein. Opinions of guests on this podcast are their own, and the podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about a guest's qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements and advertisements for products or services. Individuals on this podcast may have direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. This podcast is owned by Hotflash Inc. Media.